July 11th, 2024. Flight 2285, operated by Clear Sky Airlines, departed from Boise, Idaho, en route to San Diego, California. Aboard were 93 passengers and 6 crew members. It was supposed to be a routine flight, 2 hours and 12 minutes through stable skies, nothing out of the ordinary. At 3:47 p.m., the aircraft disappeared from radar over a rugged mountainous region between Nevada and California. No distress signal, no transponder ping, just silence. Within hours, emergency response teams were mobilized. News outlets cut into regular programming. Breaking, flight missing over Sierra Crest. Satellite images showed a storm system moving into the area, but it hadn't reached the flight path yet, or so the FAA claimed. Families waited, social media exploded, rumors spread. At 5:06 p.m., the first wreckage was located by a search helicopter. A wingtip lodged between pine trees, small fires burning on the hillside, and no visible survivors. The official statement came that evening. At approximately 3:47 p.m. Pacific Time, Clear Sky Airlines Flight 2285 lost contact with air traffic control. Initial reports confirm wreckage in the Sierra Nevada region. Search and rescue operations are ongoing. At this time, we presume all lives aboard have been lost. The nation grieved, candles lit, vigils held, hashtags trended. Flight 2285, never forgotten. The preliminary report released a week later gave a simple explanation. Unexpected mechanical failure, possible decompression, and a fatal descent. Bodies were being recovered, some intact, others burned beyond recognition. Families demanded answers. Most accepted the tragic finality of it all, but not everyone. The crash site was described as virtually inaccessible. Rescue teams reached it by air and foot, battling both the terrain and time. Some bodies were identified quickly. Others were listed as missing but presumed dead. Among them, a 34-year-old data analyst named Daniel Everett, seat 22A. Daniel's family received the call on July 13th. No body found, but no chance of survival. He was declared legally dead by July 17th. His name was added to the memorial being constructed at San Diego Airport. And yet, 6 days later, everything changed. July 17th, 6:24 a.m. A man staggered into a gas station in Wadsworth, Nevada, dirty, barefoot, dehydrated, and bleeding from a long gash in his thigh. He collapsed on the floor, whispering something the clerk couldn't understand at first. Then clearer. Flight 2285. I was on the plane. I survived. The man was Daniel Everett. His reappearance shocked the nation. Journalists camped outside the hospital. The FAA scrambled for comment. Investigators rushed to interview him. Daniel's story, however, was anything but simple, and the questions began piling up fast. How had he survived when no one else had? Why hadn't rescue teams found him earlier? What had he seen? And why did his version of the crash differ so drastically from the official narrative? Daniel couldn't answer everything right away. He was suffering from exposure, multiple fractures, infection, and memory gaps. But one thing was clear. He hadn't just wandered away from the crash. He had escaped it. And what he described next would unravel everything we thought we knew about Flight 2285. The official version, now under scrutiny, described a clean timeline: aircraft malfunction, loss of control, high-impact crash, total fatality. But Daniel's testimony hinted at something else. The plane didn't fall immediately. He claimed there was a loud explosion near the rear fuselage, followed by chaos, but not complete destruction. He remembered seeing passengers alive post-impact, moving through smoke. He described a second fire erupting, not from the engine, but from beneath the cabin floor, and he remembered voices, arguing voices, before everything went black. The public wanted to believe him, or feared they already did. The official narrative no longer held. What started as a tragic accident was beginning to look like something much more complicated. The FAA maintained its position. "We are working closely with NTSB to validate all claims." But behind the scenes, panic was growing. What if one survivor could prove that someone lied? What if Flight 2285 didn't just crash? What if it was brought down? The clerk at the dusty gas station in Wadsworth, Nevada, would later tell reporters he thought the man was a hallucination. "He looked like a ghost," the clerk said. "Blood on his pants, dirt in his teeth, eyes like he'd seen something the rest of us can't even imagine." It was 6:24 in the morning, and the sun hadn't fully risen over the high desert. The air was dry, the silence heavy. The man stumbled through the door barefoot, barely able to speak. His lips were cracked, his hair caked in sweat and ash. He collapsed near the drink fridge. Within minutes, paramedics arrived. The man was taken to Northern Nevada Medical Center, unconscious. He had a fractured collarbone, severe dehydration, second-degree burns on his legs, and a high fever due to infection. His wallet was missing, his ID gone, but in his pocket they found a scorched boarding pass, Flight 2285, Seat 22A. Fingerprint analysis confirmed the impossible. Daniel Everett was alive. For days, Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he spoke in fragments of fire, of darkness, of a woman named Maya who didn't appear on the flight manifest. He repeated a phrase in a near whisper. It wasn't an accident. News of his survival hit every major outlet within hours. CNN. Man declared dead walks out of Sierra crash zone. NBC. Flight 2285 mystery deepens, one survivor found alive. Reddit exploded with conspiracy theories. Naive Flight 2285 trended for days. The Everett family, devastated just a week before, was now at the center of a miracle. But their joy was quickly overtaken by concern, because Daniel's story wasn't just shocking, it was dangerous. Day 2, Hospital Room 304. Agents from the NTSB and FAA were first to arrive. They asked Daniel about the crash, about the moments before impact. Daniel, though groggy, began to describe things that didn't fit the official timeline. There was a bang, not engine, behind us. Something shook the floor. Then fire, not on the wing, under us. He described waking up pinned beneath part of the cabin, the cold metal pressing into his side. He crawled out through an opening in the fuselage, where he said he saw another survivor. A woman, alive, trapped, screaming. He tried to go back for her, but fire spread too fast. He had to run. But there was no record of anyone else surviving, no trace of a woman named Maya. And the investigators, they were quick to dismiss it all. "He's delusional," one FAA agent told a reporter off the record. "Severe trauma. The mind creates things to cope." But Daniel wasn't done. Day 3, memory returning. Daniel began mapping his path out of the mountains on a sheet of hospital paper. He pointed out landmarks, a ravine, a burnt tree line, a twisted metal fragment he used as a crutch. His knowledge of the crash site was too detailed to ignore. He had survived 6 days with no supplies. He had drunk from rain puddles, eaten snow, cauterized a wound with burning metal. What's more, his timeline contradicted the official version. The flight had not gone down immediately. The descent was controlled for several minutes before a second explosion tore the cabin. He remembered passengers arguing in the aisle. Not panicking, arguing, and most damning of all, he claimed he heard a voice on the intercom after the initial impact, telling people not to move, not to leave the aircraft. "It wasn't the pilot's voice," he told the nurse. "It was someone else, calm, cold, like it was planned." This changed everything. The FAA refused further interviews. Clear Sky Airlines declined comment. The NTSB postponed its next briefing. A whistleblower inside the search operation leaked an internal memo that mentioned anomalies in the flight data recorder. Within hours, it was scrubbed from the internet, and Daniel Everett, once a quiet analyst from Portland, had become the most dangerous voice in America. He didn't look like a miracle. He looked broken. Daniel Everett lay in a hospital bed with wires on his chest, gauze around his thigh, and his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of room 304. The media called him the man who walked out of the wreckage, but Daniel barely recognized the man on the screen. His reflection was gaunt, his skin a patchwork of bruises and burns, and his voice, once crisp and analytical, now came out hoarse, careful, like it was afraid to say too much. Before July 11th, Daniel was almost invisible. An analyst for a logistics firm, divorced, no children, quiet. His co-workers described him as punctual and nice, which is another way of saying no one really knew him. He wasn't the kind of man who drew attention. He paid his taxes early. He kept his headphones on at the gym. He never missed his mother's birthday, even if she had passed 5 years earlier. His world was orderly, reliable. Then came the fire, the crash, and the walk through hell. In the hospital, trauma specialists said he was still in cognitive disassociation, that he was struggling to process what he'd experienced. But the nurses said otherwise. They noticed the way he flinched when anyone entered the room too quickly, how he always kept a blanket over his lower body, even in the heat, how he double-checked the lock on the door every night, as if afraid someone might come for him, not to help, but to silence. The investigators came with their notebooks and their softened voices. They treated him like a ticking clock. Ask a question. Wait. Ask again. Daniel answered most of them, but never twice the same way. He was clear about one thing. He didn't crash. He was forced down, a trauma-induced delusion, the officials claimed. But then the details started stacking up. Daniel knew about a broken access panel under the rear galley, one not listed in the maintenance logs. He described a storage compartment behind row 29 that had smelled of fuel hours before takeoff. He remembered a passenger with a laptop plugged into the emergency comms outlet, something not accessible without a key. "None of that's public record," whispered one nurse to another. "How would he know?" And then there was Maya. He spoke about her in pieces, how they locked eyes after the first explosion, how she calmed a child, how she tried to help a man with a broken leg, how she was still alive when he escaped the burning shell of the plane. He didn't remember her last name. He barely remembered her face, but he insisted she existed. "She wasn't part of the manifest," said the NTSB official. "There's no Maya." "She was there," Daniel said flatly. "She saved my life." More troubling than his words were his silences. Sometimes he would go completely still, eyes open but unseeing. Once a nurse found him pressing his hand to the window, whispering the same phrase. "They knew. Before we even took off, they knew." Psychologists began preparing a PTSD diagnosis. But then Daniel requested something. A map. He unfolded it over his hospital bed, shaky fingers tracing valleys and ridges. He drew the crash zone, not from memory, but from experience. He marked where he crawled out, where he hid from helicopters he feared might not be there to help, where he followed the sound of a river, where he found the frozen body of another passenger whose name he didn't know, half buried in snow. The coordinates matched the crash site, and not just the official location. He pointed out wreckage fields no one had disclosed. How could he have imagined them? People began to whisper, doctors, nurses, journalists with sources. Maybe this wasn't delusion. Maybe this was the first real testimony from someone who'd seen what they weren't supposed to. Daniel stopped asking questions. He started watching. Every night he would check the hallway outside his room. One night, he found a nurse's badge on the floor, but no one on staff recognized the name. The camera footage for that wing was incomplete due to maintenance. The next day, Daniel refused to speak to investigators without a lawyer. The hospital assigned him a new room, 2 floors higher. They added a guard outside. The official reason was patient safety due to high media interest, but Daniel knew better. Someone was listening. Someone wanted him quiet. And worst of all, he still didn't know why the plane went down or who wanted him gone. Only that he wasn't supposed to survive. The human body isn't built to survive what Daniel Everett did. The doctors confirmed this in sterile terms. Hypovolemia, infection risk, muscle breakdown, possible exposure-induced psychosis. But survival is rarely logical. It's primal, ugly, unscripted, and Daniel's story, if even half of it was true, had rewritten the rules of what's possible. The crash itself was only the beginning. Daniel remembered the heat first, not fire, radiating heat, as if the earth itself was rejecting the wreckage. He came to half-buried, under twisted metal, the world muffled by debris and smoke. It wasn't quiet. It was the kind of noise that sits behind your eyes, vibrating. Somewhere nearby, someone was crying. A child, maybe. Then coughing. Then silence. He couldn't move at first. His left leg was pinned and there was blood in his mouth. But something stronger than pain took over, the certainty that if he didn't get up, he'd die. He pulled himself free, tearing muscle and skin in the process. The effort made him vomit. He passed out. When he came to again, night had fallen. The cold was a different kind of danger now. Fire had swept through part of the fuselage, leaving skeletal remains of seats and limbs. The smell of jet fuel was so strong, it felt like a taste. He tried to call for help, but his throat was raw from smoke. No signal, no phone, no movement around him. He was alone. The next hours, or maybe days, blurred. He remembers light and dark, pain and thirst. He found an intact meal cart, used its sharp edge to cut away a piece of seatbelt, then fashioned it into a tourniquet for his leg. He found water dripping from the underside of a twisted panel, caught it with his fingers, and sucked them dry. He tore the lining from a seat to wrap his feet, now blistered and bleeding. He screamed once, not for help, for rage. He walked, dragging one leg behind him, holding a broken tray as a makeshift cane. The terrain was unforgiving, steep, icy in places. He fell, repeatedly. At one point he lay in a gully, convinced he wouldn't wake up again. But something inside him refused to surrender. Something old, primitive, something that said, "Get up or you'll die here." He moved only at night, not because of animals, but because he feared being seen. That was the part he struggled to explain. He claimed, more than once, that he'd seen lights, flashlights, too precise to be rescue teams. He heard voices, but not the kind that called out names or coordinates. Once, hiding under brush, he swore he saw men in dark jackets walking in formation near the wreckage, not looking for survivors, but searching for something else. He didn't know what. On the fourth night, he thinks it was the fourth, he stumbled upon a burnt tablet, melted and blackened, buried in ash. Next to it, a boot with no foot inside, and farther off, a black duffel bag with no tags. He reached for it but heard a branch snap behind him. He didn't wait to see who or what was there. He kept moving. The injuries got worse. His left thigh was infected. He began to hallucinate. Trees moving, shadows whispering, old memories bleeding into the present. He talked to his mother, to Maya, to someone he couldn't name. Sometimes he heard the sound of the plane again, crashing over and over in his head. But one moment pierced through everything. He remembered finding a photo on the ground, half buried in snow. A smiling family, parents and a girl, maybe 9. It wasn't his. He took it anyway, wrapped it in cloth. It felt like an anchor, like proof that someone had lived, that someone mattered. It gave him the strength to walk again. When he finally saw the outline of the gas station in the distance, he thought it was a dream. He was crawling by then, more animal than man. When the doorbell chimed as he stumbled inside, the clerk's scream barely registered. Daniel had already collapsed. They said it was a miracle, but miracles don't bleed like that. And the real question wasn't how he'd survived. It was what he had seen and who didn't want him to talk about it. Daniel Everett's story should have ended with survival. A miraculous reappearance, a quiet recovery, maybe a book deal. But instead, what followed was suspicion, silence and shadows, because the wreckage of Flight 22285 wasn't just debris, it was evidence. And someone, somewhere, was working hard to control what that evidence said. Officially, the crash site had been secured within 24 hours. Drone images were shared with the public, a field of twisted aluminum, charred earth, scattered belongings. The narrative was clear, a mid-air explosion caused by catastrophic engine failure. A tragedy, yes, but one explained, documented, and closed. But Daniel's survival changed the stakes. He remembered sections of the plane intact. He remembered walking past seats still bolted to the floor, food trays unopened, exit doors half-blown, but still attached. He described fuselage segments that should have disintegrated on impact. He recalled specific locations where bodies had been, people still breathing, crawling, trying to escape. None of those details matched the crash report, and that's when the anomalies started to pile up. First, a journalist from Reno named Gillian Marks published an anonymous tip. Parts of the flight recorder were missing. The black box had been recovered, yes, but the data was incomplete. 7 minutes of cockpit audio were gone. In its place, static. Then came the image leaks, satellite photos showing emergency crews pulling something large, metallic, and not from the plane, onto a flatbed truck. The NTSB refused to comment. But the real break came from someone inside. A technician, later identified as Travis May, posted a cryptic message on an encrypted forum. Flight 22285, explosive residue in cargo bay. Not from fuel, not mechanical, and a manifest discrepancy. 3 extra passengers. No ID, no ticket. The post vanished within hours. So did Travis May. Daniel, still recovering, was moved to a secure facility under the pretense of protective custody. But the cameras in his room never blinked. The guards at his door were not hospital staff. And his lawyer, appointed by the state, was replaced without explanation after requesting access to the full crash file. Things got stranger. A week later, Daniel received an envelope. No return address. Inside, a single Polaroid photograph. Blurry, taken at night. But the image was unmistakable. It showed the crash site. And in the corner, emerging from smoke and snow, was a figure. Upright. Walking. It wasn't Daniel. The person was shorter, slighter, possibly female. Maya. Daniel turned the photo over. On the back, a single phrase in smudged ink. Not alone. He couldn't sleep after that. Every knock at the door made him flinch. Every shadow outside his window felt like a warning. He began writing everything down. Maps, memories, theories, names. He filled notebooks with questions the government wouldn't ask. Why did a flight with no high-profile passengers get diverted from its original path without a weather reason? Why were the manifest records scrubbed within hours of the crash? Why did multiple rescue workers report seeing signs of movement 2 days after the declared total fatality? And perhaps most haunting of all, why was he still alive? The deeper he looked, the more it felt like Flight 2285 hadn't just fallen from the sky. It had been pushed. He began to suspect the crash wasn't about the plane. It was about what or who was inside. Maybe a witness, maybe a courier. Maybe a secret that had to be buried. Whatever it was, someone had made sure the narrative was airtight. But Daniel Everett, limping and bruised and terrified, had blown a hole right through it. And the more he remembered, the more dangerous he became. The wreckage had secrets. Secrets that didn't burn, secrets that didn't break, and secrets that someone very powerful was willing to bury beneath a mountain. At first, the cracks were almost invisible. A misplaced timestamp, a mislabeled photograph, a clerical error in the flight manifest. But for those paying attention, and by now many were, these small inconsistencies began to form a web. Not one mistake, but a pattern, and behind that pattern, the unmistakable outline of a lie. Daniel Everett became the center of a storm he never asked for. Journalists, whistleblowers, conspiracy theorists, aviation experts, all of them wanted something from him. Answers, evidence, a soundbite. He spoke carefully, guarded. But his silence only fueled more curiosity. Why would the sole survivor of the worst domestic air disaster in a decade be kept from the public eye? A reporter from a fringe media outlet managed to smuggle out a recording of Daniel whispering through a hospital room intercom. "They want this forgotten. They told me not to talk about the woman, or the voices, or the smoke coming from under the floor." It was enough. Overnight, the official story collapsed under the weight of scrutiny. Families of the victims began demanding a second investigation. Lawsuits were filed. A civil aviation watchdog group called Flight Truth began its own inquiry. They tracked down a ground control technician from the Boise airport who confirmed that Flight 2285 had been grounded earlier that week due to a classified systems audit. That audit was never disclosed in the FAA's crash report. When pressed, FAA spokespeople said it was unrelated, routine. But the technician insisted otherwise. There was a man, military or private sector, but he had a badge I'd never seen. He was on board during the maintenance check, stayed in the cargo hold for nearly an hour, wouldn't speak to anyone. Then he left. That's not routine. Meanwhile, Daniel's memory began to sharpen. He stopped second-guessing himself. He no longer asked if what he'd seen was real. He knew it was. He remembered that before takeoff there had been a delay, announced vaguely as baggage recalibration. But he'd seen two men in suits loading something large into the plane's forward bay. He remembered how they didn't speak, didn't interact with the ground crew, how one of them had a scar down his jaw, and how the other tapped the nose of the plane twice before stepping away. Superstition or signal. In a quiet moment, Daniel told his new lawyer, a woman named Naomi Cardoza, that he wasn't sure if he was supposed to survive. That maybe he had seen something or someone that made him a liability. Naomi listened carefully. She didn't dismiss him. She didn't call it trauma. She wrote everything down. And then she disappeared. Not in the dramatic sense. No vanishing act, no last message. She simply stopped responding. Her office closed. Her email bounced back. Daniel's calls went unanswered. The Bar Association listed her as on leave. She was gone. That's when Daniel realized he wasn't just part of the story. He was the story. What he knew, what he remembered, was dangerous. Too many details contradicted the neat, tragic bow the authorities had tied around Flight 2285. Too many loose threads had been quietly tucked away. But now they were unraveling. A leaked document from a military contractor, Veritas Systems, surfaced online. The document referenced a live transit exercise scheduled for July 11th, the same day as the crash. Its location, the airspace over the Sierra Corridor. The description was vague. Non-civilian equipment transport via air. But the code assigned to the operation matched an FAA no-fly advisory issued hours after the crash. None of this appeared in the final NTSB report. When asked during a press conference if there had been any military equipment on board Flight 2285, the spokesperson answered simply, "No comment." And that, for many, was the final straw. Daniel Everett was no longer just a survivor. He was a symbol. Proof that something had gone wrong, that something had been hidden, that maybe the dead weren't just victims of an accident, but of a choice. Flight 2285 didn't just fall from the sky, it was pulled. And the truth was starting to scream through the cracks. The room was cold, not from the air conditioning, but from the presence of too many people who didn't belong. Men in dark suits lined the walls, their arms folded, their eyes hidden behind mirrored lenses. Microphones rested like vipers on the table in front of Daniel Everett. The air smelled of printer ink and something metallic. It had taken weeks to get here. Weeks of silence, of evasion, of attempts to scrub his presence from the headlines. But the pressure had built too far. The leaks, the inconsistencies, the footage of Daniel entering a secure facility in Nevada and never leaving. It was too much. The public demanded a statement, and so, behind closed doors, the FAA organized what they called a controlled debriefing. They called it that. But Daniel knew what it really was. Containment. He had asked for Naomi Cardoza to be present. She was still missing. In her place, they assigned him a new handler, Agent Roma, quiet, polite, whose smile never reached his eyes. Roma had been the one to slide the recorder across the table and say, "When you're ready, Mr. Everett." Daniel stared at the blinking red light. It pulsed like a heartbeat. He took a breath. "I remember the sound first," he began. It wasn't mechanical. It was hollow, like something had torn inside the plane. Then the lights flickered, and there was smoke under our feet, not from the engine. I remember someone shouting, but not the crew, a passenger. They were trying to get to the cockpit. He paused. Someone in the back scribbled a note. They weren't panicking. They were focused, like they knew something was happening. More silence. Daniel kept speaking. "I unbuckled to help, but then the first explosion hit. It came from under the floor, rear of the plane, not the wings. The pressure slammed me into the seat in front. After that, it's fragments, screams, oxygen masks, a woman beside me bleeding from her ears. And then..." He looked up. "Then I saw her. Maya." The suits shifted. The name had become a thorn in every debriefing, every report. "She wasn't on the manifest," Daniel continued. "I know, I've been told that 100 times, but she was there. She helped me unbuckle. She tied a cloth around my arm. She stayed behind to help someone else. And when I crawled out, she was still inside. I tried to go back." "You were disoriented," said a voice near the wall. Daniel ignored it. "There were people alive after the crash, not just me. I saw at least 4 others, moving, coughing. One tried to break a window. But then the second fire started. It moved fast, too fast, not like jet fuel, like accelerant. Another shift, another pen scratching. And there were others outside," Daniel added. "Others?" Roma asked. "Not rescuers, not uniformed. They had gear, radios, flashlights, but they didn't come near. They stood on the ridge, watching. I saw them the night after the crash, and again 2 nights later." Roma leaned forward. "Do you have any proof?" Daniel held up a photo. The Polaroid. "This was left for me. No sender, no message. Just this." Roma didn't reach for it. "That photo could have been doctored." Daniel smiled, bitter. "You mean like the black box audio you scrubbed?" That shut the room down. Daniel leaned back. "I'm not here to make accusations. I'm here to say what happened. You asked for the truth. That's it." Roma clicked the recorder off. The red light vanished, and with it, so did any hope that Daniel's words would make it into the public record. They never released the transcript. They never confirmed the meeting. But 2 days later, Daniel Everett was moved again, this time under the guise of protective reassignment. His location remains unknown, but the video was leaked, not the official one. A second recording, captured from a phone hidden in a jacket pocket by a sympathetic tech, it surfaced on an independent journalist's channel. The footage was grainy, but Daniel's voice was clear. The video went viral in hours. Millions watched, and for the first time, the world heard it. The crash wasn't an accident. There were survivors besides Daniel, and someone, maybe many, wanted them to disappear. Daniel Everett wasn't speaking to a committee. He was speaking to the world. After the leak, the floodgates didn't just open, they exploded. The video of Daniel Everett's suppressed testimony made its way across every platform. X, Reddit, YouTube, encrypted forums, podcasts. The footage was pixelated, the audio muffled, but the message was unmistakable. This wasn't just about a plane crash anymore. This was about the manipulation of truth, a conspiracy, a cover-up carried out with surgical precision. Mainstream outlets tried to ignore it at first. Then came the counterclaims, experts casting doubt on the video's authenticity, spokespeople dismissing it as a hoax crafted for attention. But the internet doesn't forget. And in the quiet corners of digital resistance, something was stirring. Anonymous sources began reaching out to journalists. A retired NTSB analyst, face blurred and voice disguised, appeared on an independent stream and said this: "The internal report had redactions I've never seen before, whole pages blacked out, photos of structural burns that didn't match engine failure, and one phrase circled in red ink: non-civilian activity, embargoed until further notice. That's not standard protocol." Then came the Veritas documents. A former contractor leaked 118 pages of internal communication between FAA security units and Veritas Systems, one of the military's largest private aerospace partners. Buried in the text were references to a sensitive payload transfer scheduled for July 11th. Flight 2285's air corridor was highlighted. The operation was tagged as Invisible Manifest, No Flight Log. Buried deeper in the same file was a line in bold red type: "If breach occurs, recover payload. Survivors not priority." The internet imploded. For many, this was confirmation. The plane wasn't just unlucky, it was targeted, used, collateral in something larger, something hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and cold calculation. And then came the most disturbing detail yet. A survivor surfaced, not Daniel. A man in his 50s, identity unreleased, appeared in a private video chat with an investigative collective known only as Trace. His face was burned, voice raspy. He didn't reveal much, but what he said sent chills across the world. "There was something in the hold, I saw it. A case, military, marked, locked. When we hit turbulence, it glowed. No one touched it, not even the men who boarded last. They weren't passengers, they were watching the case." He paused, then whispered, "I think it was alive." Trace investigators tried to follow up, but the man vanished. His IP was traced to a motel in Fresno. When authorities arrived, the room was empty. Blood on the floor. No signs of struggle. No record of his stay. Suddenly, people who had doubted Daniel Everett began to wonder, what if he was telling the truth from the start? What if the woman, Maya, was real? What if others survived and were either silenced or still out there, hiding? Daniel's name returned to the headlines, now as both a martyr and a warning. He hadn't been seen publicly since the leak. His family declined all interviews. Whispers spread that he'd been relocated under federal watch, but no agency claimed custody. An FOIA request for his status returned only one word: classified. And yet, the truth kept slipping through. An air traffic controller, anonymously, published tower audio from the day of the crash. Hidden behind static was a second voice, overriding the pilot's final transmission. Not from the cockpit, not from ground control. A calm, measured male voice giving precise instructions. Maintain route, no deviation, payload stable, all units ready. The voice was never identified. In the wake of these revelations, pressure mounted. Protests erupted at FAA headquarters. A petition demanding a new investigation gathered 3.5 million signatures. Political figures, once silent, began asking questions. A senator from Oregon, under pressure from his constituents, tweeted, "If this many people are lying, then what is the truth we're being protected from?" But the institutions stayed quiet. The FAA, the NTSB, Clear Sky Airlines, Veritas Systems, all silent. What began as a tragedy was now an open wound on the public psyche. People stopped flying. Emergency legislation was drafted to audit private aerospace contracts. And at the center of it all was a man who walked out of fire, alone, broken, and determined to be heard. Flight 2285 wasn't just a disaster. It was a message. And someone, somewhere, was desperate to make sure that message was never fully understood. It didn't come in a press conference, not from a podium, not through a whistleblower waving classified documents in the air. The truth arrived quietly, one pixel at a time, in a video posted to a secure server, one that had never been indexed by any public search engine. It opened with no title, no music, Just a shot of mountains at dawn, filmed from what looked like a handheld camera. The voice that followed was unmistakable. Daniel Everett. "I don't know how long this video will stay up," he began, his voice steady. "But I need to say this while I can." He was pale, thinner than before, eyes tired but focused. His hair was shorter now. The backdrop behind him was indeterminate, just blank concrete, faintly lit. A bunker, maybe, or a basement. He spoke slowly, deliberately, like every word was a thread holding together a tapestry that others had tried to burn. He confirmed everything. The woman, Maya, had existed. He remembered her last name, Calder. He had found it on her boarding pass, still in his pocket when he reached the hospital. She wasn't in the official manifest because she wasn't part of the flight. She had boarded last without scanning a ticket, escorted by two men in dark jackets. Her seat was listed as empty. She had warned him. 30 minutes before the first explosion, she had leaned over and whispered, "If anything happens, don't follow the crew. Go the opposite way." He hadn't understood then. But after the crash, when he saw where the fires began, where the exits were blocked, where certain passengers weren't moving, even though they should have been, he understood. She had saved his life. He talked about the case. A black, reinforced military container, roughly the size of a small coffin. He'd seen it loaded through the belly of the aircraft while others were boarding. He'd thought nothing of it until it began to glow in the dark. He described the noise it made, not mechanical, organic, breathing maybe, or mimicking breath. He wasn't sure, but it wasn't inert, and it wasn't cargo. He went further. He described being followed after the hospital, surveillance vans, drones, anonymous messages on burner phones telling him to stop asking questions. One day, a package arrived on his doorstep, his bloodied shirt from the crash site, folded neatly, no note, just a single dog tag sewn into the collar. Not his. The name on the tag, Maya Calder. That was when he knew he couldn't stay in the system. He had to disappear. Not just for his safety, but for the story to survive. In the video, he held up documents, photos, audio recordings, a flight engineer's log showing override commands issued from a satellite link not registered with the FAA, a time-stamped scan of Maya's ID badge, Veritas Clearance Level 6, a blurry still image of what looked like an eye, something not human, but not robotic either. The final file he held up was a printed page, stamped "Retrieve or Contain," issued 6 days before Flight 2285 took off. "I'm not a journalist," he said. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who survived the thing I wasn't supposed to. I'm sorry I can't tell you everything, but what I've shown you, this is real, and if I vanish after this, you'll know why." He ended with one sentence. There were 10 minutes missing from that black box. You just heard all of them. The video lasted 17 minutes. Within 4 hours, it had been downloaded over 2 million times. Within 8, the server was destroyed by what experts called a precision data bomb, a cyber weapon with a single purpose, digital erasure. But it was too late. The truth was out. Within days, pressure on Veritas systems intensified. A congressional hearing was scheduled. Clear Sky Airlines issued a new statement, this time admitting that special cargo had been aboard Flight 22285, but denying any knowledge of its nature. FAA officials refused to testify, but others did. A former Veritas pilot confirmed the existence of experimental transport flights routed through civilian channels to avoid oversight. A bioengineer, protected under whistleblower status, revealed the classified project codename, Aura 9. She wouldn't say what it was, only this. It wasn't meant to fly over civilians, it wasn't meant to crash. Protests erupted in Washington. Air travel dropped by 34% nationally. A mass FOIA lawsuit was filed against the Department of Transportation, and Daniel Everett, last seen in that grainy bunker, was now considered a national symbol. A survivor, yes, but also now a threat. No one knew where he was, but his voice was everywhere, and the truth he carried had changed everything. The world didn't end after Daniel Everett's video. Planes didn't fall from the sky, the government didn't collapse. But something fundamental shifted, like a hairline crack forming across the surface of trust, spreading slowly and silently, impossible to seal. In the weeks that followed, the narrative around Flight 2285 became something more than aviation history. It became a mirror. For some, it reflected a government willing to lie to protect an asset. For others, it revealed the terrifying possibility that there are things flying over our heads we were never meant to understand. But for most, it was the reminder that truth, once set loose, cannot be recaptured. The names of the victims were etched in glass at a memorial site near the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Families still gathered there, laying flowers, speaking the names of loved ones into the wind. But now, those ceremonies carried more than grief. They carried questions, rage, hope. Because if Daniel had survived, maybe someone else had too. One name in particular became legend. Maya Calder. No official record, no passenger log, no ID. And yet, her name was whispered in podcasts, written on posters, inked into the skin of those who believed. She had become a ghost of the truth, a symbol of resistance. Online communities sprung up. The Mayans, they called themselves, dedicated to unearthing the full story. Some believed she was still alive. Others thought she had died saving Daniel. None had proof, only fragments. Daniel Everett never resurfaced. The final confirmed sighting placed him at a safe house in southern Argentina. After that, nothing. Some say he went underground. Others believe he was taken by the same forces he exposed. A few believe he chose silence, understanding that the truth no longer needed him to speak. It was already screaming through the world on its own. Clear Sky Airlines was quietly dissolved under a wave of lawsuits and federal scrutiny. The FAA underwent leadership changes. Veritas Systems denied all involvement but lost billions in defense contracts. Still, no agency was held accountable. No arrests were made. The machine, though dented, kept turning, but not everyone forgot. Independent investigations continued. The Trace Collective released a digital archive of redacted reports, satellite images, and interviews under the name the Aura Files. University students wrote theses on Flight 2285. Documentaries aired. A movie was pitched, then quietly shelved. Too close, the studio said, too soon. And in the quiet corners of the world, people began to look up differently. Not in awe, not in fear, but in awareness, as if expecting something to fall. Because the truth wasn't just about what happened that day in July. It was about what we're willing to believe, about who we're willing to listen to, and about the cost of silence. Daniel's last message, before the video, before the bunker, was scrawled on the back of a discharge form from the hospital, found later by a nurse who had refused to delete his records. It said, "If I vanish, don't look for me, look for her." To this day, no one knows where Maya Calder came from. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the question is what she was trying to protect, and whether what fell from the sky that day was ever meant to be found.